Hello, it is Joseph, and welcome back to another episode of Colonizing Kerbin. We are on the 23rd episode of the series, and in this episode, we're going to make our final preparations for sending colonists off to Duna and Laythe. Now, before we do that, though, we gotta actually go out to Laythe, where the Laythe satellite network is arriving in the Jool system and is using a Tylo gravity assist to attain a capture orbit around Jool. And then this satellite craft is going to run some science real quickly while it is in orbit around Tylo, while it's passing by Tylo, because we haven't run any science yet, even though we have used Tylo a few times to capture orbit around Jool. And now we are about to make the final burn so that the satellite network can rendezvous with Laythe, and then it will make a capture burn around Laythe. So this is the final satellite network we're going to be setting up in this playthrough. We have a satellite network around Jool in between the orbits of Tylo and Val. And then we have one around Duna and Ike, Minmus, Mun, and Kerbin. All right, so the satellite network around Laythe is going to circularize at 3 million meters above the surface of Kerbin. Here's the resonant orbit calculator one more time, showing you how I do the calculations, or the resonant orbit calculator does the calculations for me for figuring out how to set up this network so that these 6 satellites can be equal distance from each other at the same orbital height. So as we pass apoapsis each time, the craft will be jettisoned, or a satellite will be jettisoned, and then it will perform its circularization burn. And once all those satellites have completed those circularizations and are in equal orbits, the upper stage is going to deorbit itself and crash into the ocean of Laythe to see if indeed this is actually water. Yeah, it sounds like water, looks like water, it's blue, so I guess we'll send some Kerbins there to live. That's all the scientific data we need, right? So real quickly, we're also going to jump out to the Laythe base, where it is on its way to the Jool system, but it needs to make an alignment burn so that it will have a capture orbit around Jool using a gravity assist. It looks like this one will be off of Tylo as well. And it's going to take another 2 years of travel in the game for it to arrive at Laythe, because this was sent at 1 or 2 transfer windows after the satellite network. All right, so on screen here, the core section of the Laythe colony ship is going into orbit, but I'm not going to spend the episode showing you me assembling this entire thing, because you can go back to the previous episode and watch me assemble the Duna colony ship, because except for the craft on screen, it is literally the same setup and the same process of getting everything inside. So this is the craft that's going to help transfer Kerbals from Laythe orbit down to the surface of Laythe. And this is a drone-operated SSTO. It is capable of getting into low Kerbin orbit just barely, but if there's any Kerbals on board or any cargo, it will not be able to, because the mass will be too high. It's also able to fold up so that it can fit into the cargo holds. Just ignore the part clipping that's going on a little bit. This is one of the things that I was doing a lot of work on over the last few weeks, and I couldn't figure out how to get it into the cargo hold without doing a little bit of part clipping, so just ignore that a little bit. But anyway, it should be able to transfer 4 Kerbals from Laythe down to the surface, Laythe orbit down to the surface, and it should be drone operated. And since we have those satellite networks in orbit, it should be able to be easily operated. But in my headcanon, it's technically going to be operated by the pilots in orbit, I guess, and a very sophisticated software program. All right, so after several launches, we got everything into the cargo holds. All of the colonists are on board. Valentina and Bob are going to be the head operators of this expedition to Laythe. And Lal Kerbin, the head engineer, is now out attaching struts to all of the cargo, just like we did with the Duna colony ship, to make sure that it doesn't shake around. And then the tunnel here is going to deassemble and store itself in the cargo hold. So in this shot here, you'll notice that the cargo hold is slightly longer than the cargo hold of the Duna colony ships, and that's to facilitate the SSTOs being in there. Unfortunately, a little mistake occurred, as you can see me showing you in slow motion on screen here. The SSTO is still sticking out of the cargo hold, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time shifting the docking port inside that cargo hold to hopefully make sure that didn't happen. And I was very frustrated by that, and I really did not want to redo the whole process and start over. And also, I thought about having a Kerbin engineer going out there and fixing it, but I said, the heck with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Let's move on. All right, so moving on with our launches and our operations here. I was discussing last episode the possibility of having a mining facility on Ike, and I decided, hey, there's a very simple way to make that happen without having to waste too much more R&D time. The Minmus fuel tanker is more than capable of getting to Duna. If you fill up the side tanks of that tanker, it can use those side tanks as additional fuel to get out to Duna. So that is what you see happening on screen. We're going to send off a copy of the Minmus fuel tanker out there. It is unmanned since we have all the colonists and the colony ships, so no point in sending them in this craft and not being able to make use of the ring station for comfort and preventing muscle atrophy. The Ike mining facility is also launched. I didn't record the launch of it, but you're going to see it on screen in just a second here after we send off the tanker to Duna. And there's me setting an alarm real quick. And there goes the tanker off to Duna. So the Ike mining base is actually the same as the Minmus mining base. I just removed the ring on the base and then added some 2 large fuel tanks in order to make sure it can get out to Duna. And it's going to do so in 2 burns. First burn, we're going to raise the apoapsis in between the Mun and Kerbin's orbit, jettison this nose cone that was used for aerodynamics when launching, and jettison the upper stage, and those things are going to crash back down on the surface of Kerbin, and that should maximize our delta V uses. And then we're going to make use of the Oberth effect when the mining facility returns to Kerbin periapsis. If you're not familiar with the Oberth effect, it basically states that when a craft is most efficient in maximizing its delta V when it fires its engines as close to periapsis, and it's even more efficient if that periapsis is as low as possible to the celestial body that you're going around. So by doing this second burn, we actually maximize our delta V getting out to Duna, and with those extra fuel tanks, we should have plenty of delta V to land on Ike. So stay tuned for next episode, I believe, when we should land that mining facility on the surface of Ike. Now, the ring was not left on that mining facility, by the way, because the Kerbins aren't meant to stay there long term, just to go pick up fuel and bring it back to this colony ship that will be left in Duna orbit when it is reassembled as a ring station. Here's me very, very slowly turning it, and this is what happens when you throttle up the engines way too fast. You can see it flopping around. I don't really like making use of auto struts whenever I can, but I did have to auto strut some of the parts here when I fired the engines to help make sure it didn't waddle around. And what I do is about 5 to 10 seconds before the maneuver node wants me to fire the engines, I very, very, very gradually start throttling up the engines. And then roughly around 200 meters per second left in the burn, I start throttling down the engines very, very, very gradually. And that helped make sure the ring didn't start oscillating and flopping around. But Bill's, just in case there was some damage, Bill is out now inspecting the colony ship to make sure everything is working properly. However, you may notice that one of the rings is not spinning. And this was before I figured out what the problem was, but the reason that the ring isn't spinning right now is because the fairing that is covering up the inner mechanisms of the rover for some reason is stopping the ring from spinning. So I'm not sure if there's a strut I can't find that's locking that down, but hopefully I'll find out where the problem is before the craft gets off to Duna. just use your imagination. That ring is totally fine. All right, so continuing on, this next launch is a drone that is a resupply drone. I was actually planning on sending this resupply drone at the next Duna transfer window, which would make more sense in the storyline, I guess, of this playthrough. However, Squad dropped a new update, and that new update includes the ground anchor that they have been talking about for a while. So I decided to load up the cargo drone with a couple of ground anchors and a few other structural pieces and send that off to Duna, and that'll give me some time to figure out what to use it for, because I'm not really sure what to use it for. A lot of the stuff in this series has been planned out months in advance, weeks in advance, and so this is kind of late in the game to just throw something in. But I figured, hey, let's send it off anyways, and maybe I'll think of a way to make use of the ground anchor. So that's the main reason for sending off the cargo drone early. Now, real briefly, we're going out to the mining outpost. It has not been off to Duna for very long, but it found an ideal place to make an alignment burn, and it's going to go straight on to Ike and easily be able to capture there in the next episode. We got one more SSTO to launch. This SSTO is a Laythe SSTO, and right now it's unmanned, and it is not able to get into low Kerbin orbit. It can easily get into low Laythe orbit on its own. Part of the reason it can't get into low Kerbin orbit is because it has a higher mass, because it's meant to be piloted by 2 Kerbals and carry 4 passengers. But it also has the Panther engine, 2 Panther engines in addition to a pair of Rapiers. And those Panther engines are meant to allow the craft to be, it's to help the craft be able to take off and land in the water, and also they're a little more efficient at low atmosphere than the Rapier engines. Anyway, you'll see that craft being used on Laythe later on, and we'll talk about it more when that happens in a later episode. Right now, a module is going to rendezvous with that Laythe SSTO, and this is what I call an interplanetary transfer module, and it's basically a big, large fuel tank with nuclear engines. I believe there's about 9 nuclear engines on this craft. So it is, again, this is an unmanned craft, and it will eventually be manned by the Laythe Colonist when it gets out to Laythe. It's going to take 2 burns to get this craft to Laythe. The first one is going to raise the apoapsis pretty close to the edge of Kerbin's sphere of influence. When we get up there, we'll jettison a couple of fuel tanks, and then next episode you'll see the second transfer burn, because it's going to take about 36 days in the game for it to make that orbit. And here's the cargo drone heading off to Duna, aligning its burn. All right, so that's pretty much going to wrap up this episode. And we're going to wrap up the episode by sending off the Laythe Colonist to Laythe. Thank you so much for watching this series. I'm hoping in either the next episode or the episode after that, we should get our Duna Colonist to Duna. So thank you so much for watching. And here are some beauty shots of the Laythe colony ship with both the rings spinning to end the episode. I will see you next time.